Możemy zaczynać? Dobrze. Dobra. W takim razie wracamy po przerwie. Dzisiaj mam przyjemność występować w roli moderatora.
Resume after a break. I'm the moderator of the third panel, Tactics and Tools. Here we are going to talk about theories in practice and practices in theory. So no doubt we are in for three very interesting speeches. We are sticking to the formula that has already been tested and proved useful. We'll listen to 15-minute talks followed by a Q&A. Our first speaker today is a literary scholar, musician and music critic, Filip Szałasek, who's going to talk about the audiosphere of objection and acoustic effect, field recordings of protests. And the microphone is yours. Can you hear me? I do hope it's all right. I believe in the conference we are moving from theory towards physical contact and towards the body. And this is precisely what's going to be the principal topic of my paper. On the one hand, we have acoustic studies that study the sound, but also use the sound. So on the one hand, I popularize my acoustic studies, and I would like to promote it as a valid and viable methodology for looking into protests, opposition, and expressiveness, or through used by collective protests. I believe in acoustic studies we have an element of opposition or rebellion against the domination of the visual culture. It seems that actually those who are not into culture are pretty well aware of this. What we see is the identification of culture with the visual culture, and the other senses seem to be marginalized, even though more recently haptic technologies have been more popular. This opposition against the visual is not does not mean that we should keep our eyes closed and we should be celibate when it comes to the visual sphere, even though acoustic ecology is very close to visual ecology in the urban context. We need to pay attention to hearing as such. This is our first assumption, and then to recalibrate our cognitive habits so that we can obtain as much information as possible on the basis of auditory stimuli. In the context of opposition or rebellion, which is the overriding topic of the conference, development of field recording technologies in good quality are dealing with quality amateur recordings during protests, during collective rallies. These recordings are a documentation of different demands, of the reaction to them. And last but not least, they document how these demands operate in the street. When people take to the streets, they walk close to one another. Some are loud, others are more hushed up. Of the tools of sound studies, which U.S. anthropologists and ethnographers may know about, is ethnological or field recordings outside of the studio, among people on the street, and field recording before it was first used to record social protests and rebellion, it had rather humble beginnings. What you may associate this from recordings of nature and some national content. There were some recordings. One of the first recordings were made in the UK by a naturalist who recorded birds, and again the intention was to promote the national agenda, to show that the UK birds sing most beautifully. Then you collect different songs and other audio material from the past. Just like those recordings of birds, these actors or the people who are recorded are treated as individuals taken out of the context, out of the ecosystem, biotope, or a cultural realm. These actors, people, and animals were not performing in their natural habitat. And that's why these recordings did not have too much value, and that's why we want field recordings to be engaged, socially engaged, to be addressing issues which are important from the perspective of the public. And we also want to break free from the obligations of ethnography or naturalism. This has been gaining ground. One of the most evident examples are Polish field recordings from women's protests. This is Women's Hell, which the title again refers to an essay by Tadeusz Bozielski. This is the first recording of protests that was officially published by a label, a recording studio that deals with field recordings, and then these recordings by Tomasz Piżo, the author, and the listeners. These recordings were remixed, and more recently we have a version where the 45 minutes of recordings is limited only to police announcements, and this makes this whole recording change completely its nature, and it makes it more scary, if you will. It's fascinating for me in the recording to hear that, unlike in many others, you can hear the movement of the author. He does not take any position, any privileged position, in a figurative or literal sense. He is standing at the stairs. People push and shove next to him. He needs to move with the mic, and you can hear this on the tape. And this really is a wonderful impression. And for some listeners, if you listen to it within the privacy of your home, it may be even more powerful than physical, actual participation in a rally. Myself, I'm an introvert, and I do not enjoy that much this experience of collectivity, of being together. But thanks to the recording, as an introvert, I can participate more fully, actually, in something which is an experience of the whole generation. So obviously, I'm being ironic here. I can I know of people who want to participate in this collective experience, but there are people who are blind, who have disabilities, and others who try to avoid crowds. And just because of that, I would like to leave you with this recording by Tomasz Pizzo about the women's hell or women's protests, street protests. And I would like to ask a question. How do we encourage people to be brave enough to oppose, to protest, to be daring enough? And now, in multimedia terms, which are very immersive, a recording of a women's protest by Tomasz Pizzo might be very efficient as a tool. If you really listen to this recording in the privacy of your home, they can be really immersive. You can be really immersed in this ecosystem. The impression is powerful, and even if you listen to it with your friends, it's really hard not to think about this a sense of injustice, where we hear in the soundtrack some police chasing people waving banners or flags, and I believe this could be very interesting as an experimental textbook, and more on the topic in the debate, in the Q&A that may follow. Thank you. Thank you so much. And now we move from the audiosphere of protest to media practices. And our next speaker is Ms. Iwona Kurz, who is an art historian and critic, a professor at the University of Warsaw, who is into modern European culture. She addresses issues of the body and gender, and her speech today is the media of protest between cardboard and Insta Fall 2020 in Poland.
Thank you very much for this introduction. Thank you to the organizers for catering to our bodies and souls, our vocal cords. I am truly enriched by the experience. If we can move on straight to the second slide, I will start by a few remarks on selected media of and tools of protest in the good old McLuhan-esque spirit of interpretation and their potential interaction with imagination and awareness with the consciousness of the limitations entailed in the media, especially in social media, and their different entanglements involved in the triangle between global media corporations, society and individuals, and the state. I think we should bear that in mind aside from the general remarks, and we should also importantly notice the networked life, which, as suggested by selected elements of Facebook and Instagram, is strictly intertwined with real life. So on the one hand, we can say that global media are even worse because they infiltrate the life of societies and its performative corporeal aspects, and in the other respect, they are also verified as a result of different real life actions. I shall begin with the photograph that obviously does not come from the protests in Poland, but rather from Palestine from December 2017, and shows you the nature of photography as a medium. Obviously, there are other media, and statues, slogans, the network itself, memes, and the body. And what transpires with reference to photography is multidimensional. And hence my selection of this very picture. There is also the third person involved behind the lens of the camera, the photographer, who shoots this scene and captures it and shows you the balance between the documentation performed by the state, documentation performed by the oppressed, defiant individual, and the narrative character of wars that we engage in these days. Przemysław Czapliński back in 2016 famously called Kingdom for a Narrative, asking for a narrative, for a story that we could subscribe to and follow. Perhaps such a story does not exist, but there are nonetheless narratives which we function within and in which we are engaged. And in this sense, photography as encapsulated and disseminated by social media is a case in point, along with the role of photographers themselves. If I can move on to the next slide, I'd be much obliged. Thank you. One of such cases in point is the archive of protests created by Rafał Milach and an agency for transmedia and storytelling, where photographers say that there is no non-interventional photographs. Every photograph is a form of intervention and a form of a narrative that captures and transmits the reality around us, which goes to show us that photograph is not so much a proof or evidence, but rather viral in terms of disseminating certain images and content. So this is paramount to its functioning today, as if it was a tribal drum of sorts, which suggests that, well, there are certain presumptions as to any photographed event that not so much corroborate facts and identity, a certain visual field located on one side or the other. We should not forget about the selfies too, which I'll address later on. The other aspect is another problem entailed in the character of media, which refers to this particular website, the website of the Archive of Protest, and that shows us latest photographs. And similar observations can be made with reference to Instagram. If you search for the women's strike on Instagram, and then the hashtag will yield around 250,000 statements made by users. And it shows you the paradoxical non-linear dynamic, which is devoid of memory and bubble-like. But it also resembles a chain or a spiral of messaging, and that departs from an event-based linear narrative, but rather resembles a Chinese whisper narrative where content is disseminated. So once we pose a question, then we think of the capacity for attracting media attention and recoining it into actual political action. Okay, if we could move on to the subsequent slide. Obviously, these slides show you an image that recurs in the public sphere, that is the media, as a panopticon, a Foucauldian suggestion that is evocative of tools tied to internalization and discipline. And Deleuze later on proposed to correct Foucauldian thesis of societies of discipline and propose societies of control instead. This photograph dates back to what I called the third taking to the street. The first of them took place in 1989, and it didn't really concern the political sphere as much as it did refer to a dispersal in the streets and the dissemination of pictures that were closeted in the previous era, and they suddenly came out of that closet and were revealed to the public. So you had all kinds of photographs coming from the private sphere that were rendered public and suddenly dispersed, and this sphere continues until this day. And on a daily basis, its continuity is evidenced by different leaflets and flyers of brothels disseminated in metropolitan areas, which will take the intimate from the intimate and private sphere and shove it into the public sphere. The other aspect that is worthy of addressing is the stopover that took place in a certain situation in which one program was only being broadcast as if to show that we only had one nation, one television, and so on. And I think the third taking to the streets is conditioned differently in terms of its social determinants, and it's referred to the political change involved in the process. And we could use different metaphors, not the panopticon, but rather a synopticon, as if in a relation where everybody is under surveillance and everybody is being observed and at the same time acts as the observer of others, which would perfectly illustrate the network of relations. But this network character of relations can also refer to a range of possibilities or suggest that there is another way of thinking at hand that can be translated into the web and then back onto the street. So the network takes to the street, so to speak. If we could go over the following slides featuring solidarity symbols, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, and this one we don't like. If we could go back to the previous slide, I will not take much of your time because this will be addressed in detail by Agnieszka Graff in the subsequent part of this panel. When it comes to this coming out of the network, it involves a certain change of canon and a disruption in continuity. We started with Cyprian Kamil-Norwid, a Polish poet, earlier on today, and the beginnings of visual imagery. We did sing other songs during our protest sessions today, not so much Bella Ciao, which was sung by Italian communists originally. Obviously, this was later rehashed by Netflix, one of the Netflix movies, and it shows you a different pop cultural context online in which what we deal with as the reshaping of well-known images, which is momentary and evanescent. As long as the series goes on, so do its symbols and their transformation. What we're trying to achieve is a durability of narratives that can be translated into social effects and social activity. So there's discontinuity on the one hand and lack of icons on the other hand, lack of focusing on a singular image that would overpower the current state of affair, and that would yield this dominant image emerging from thousands upon thousands of different images. Another one would be these cardboard slogans based on meme generators online. So you've got this cardboard and the background and a slogan which you superimpose on the picture. It's a ready-made form that everybody can use and work with in order to express their individuality, their creative spirit, or the diverse character of individual initiatives. And if we move on to the Solidarity Monument that was shown before, here it is, then we could also inquire about, concrete involved in the building of, in the erection of this monument. And we have different masculine figures involved. We've got Gary Cooper, we've got Ronald Reagan, we've got Lech Wałęsa, all of them men striking down communism. But the social imagery is more than just about that. And well, if we could associate it with the crisis of representative democracy based on a party system, we could say that our protests have a character that is bubble-like, in a sense that they are always particular as to their cause they represent, and as to the alliances formed that may or may not translate onto other aspects or other notions. So it is very uncertain whether we will be able to maintain these alliances and use them for other causes and to other purposes. So I'd suggest that this is a hive-like society in which these respective constituents are very much in flux and substitutive mutually, and that overlap across different dimensions of social life and can shift and remain in a state of constant flux. I know that my time is slowly coming to an end, so I will move on directly to slide number 19. And you've got different monuments above that I wanted to present here that were also exemplary of this phenomenon. In this one, we've got the issue of selfie and the body. Bart Staszewski has mentioned many a time how important protests are as a meeting of bodies. So a meeting that produces attention as a necessary visibility of the protesters and their postulates on the one hand, and attention that, if we go back to the first picture, goes all the way back to the right to gaze, which inevitably leads to the right of appearance and public performance in the public sphere in a safe way, as well as the right to tell one's own narrative in the public sphere. In the subsequent slide, you can see the Islamic Rape of Europe, a cover from one of the Polish weeklies. Obviously, Europe is depicted as a female body. Obviously, we live in a country that sells chicken breast and chainsaws using naked women's bodies, and on the other hand, we are very much outraged by the prospective vision of a supposed mass invasion of men that will rape our women. So the female body as the representative of the highest incarnation of the collective community and the traditional imagery. Right here, you've got a picture that transgressed this image and played off of it. and also ties in with the selfie as a means of self-presentation that is massively criticized as an emanation of narcissistic culture. But you should also notice that whenever we address social media and functioning in social media, then we have to recognize that while the photograph taken during a protest is a testament to our experience during the protest, it is also a vessel of popularity or publicity, and that links us to others who share our beliefs or feelings. And I think that this narcissistic metaphor should undergo a certain rethinking. The other matter that should be addressed is aestheticization, excuse me. Whenever you think of Instagram, you think of filters, angles, and other visual effects, and any protests involved during the women's strike protests in Poland were very performative and were driven by conscious choices. For sure. So people performed their emotions and fear. And going back to Walter Benjamin, humanity that once was public for the games of divine characters became a game in and of itself. Obviously, Benjamin wrote that in the context of aestheticization of fascist policy and the crumbs that fascism leaves to the general public, throwing them into uniforms and forcing them into singing songs and marching with torches. I guess that this is where a certain fuse is located, a fuse that provisions that something will come out of this hive-like community, and a fuse that will also help disperse protests and prevent them from congesting into a mass when you think of the crowd. So there is a difference between the crowd and the mass, and I think the difference should be accentuated. Thank you very much.
We will move on to the third speaker, Agnieszka Korzeniowska-Polak, Doctor of Law in the Institute of Law in Łódź, and her paper is The Right to Obtain Information About the Activities of Public Authorities as a Fighting Tool of Rebellious People.
Halo, halo, poprosimy o odblokowanie mikrofonu.
Mam nadzieję, że mnie już słychać.
Jeszcze chwileczkę, jeszcze musimy coś przełączyć i już będzie.
Nie wiem, czy mnie już słychać.
Poprosimy teraz o wpływ mikrofonu.
Teraz mnie już słychać.
Wchodzi na Zoom na tym komputerze, nie wiem czemu tutaj do systemu mamy problem.
Dobrze, to jeszcze poprosimy o chwilę cierpliwości.
Po informatycznemu wyłączy.
Mój
Prosimy teraz o głos.
Czy widać mnie i czy mnie słychać?
Prosić o próbę mikrofonu?
Czy widać mnie i czy mnie słychać?
Nasz system nie działa.
Mamy jakieś wyjście z tej
Wiesz co, no, jedyne co, mogę zresetować wszystko, to przez chwilkę,
takie problemy techniczne, więc możemy kontynuować.
Glitches are over, and now we can start. Sorry for being behind schedule. Now we will listen to Dr. Agnieszka Korzeniowska-Polak, who will talk about the right to obtain information about the activities of public authorities as a fighting tool of rebellious people. Unfortunately, we still have a technical glitch. We cannot hear you. We cannot hear you. Can you see me at least?
Może pani ma wyłączone. Czekaj.
To make sure to establish related to legal provisions. All areas of life are subject to legal provision. It's really worthwhile to know. Rebellious people can use, according to the definition from the language dictionary, a rebellion is an opposition of a group of people against authority. It's kind of expresses their negation.
żądanie określonego działania czy zaniechania przez władzę publiczną. Zawsze buntujemy się przeciwko komuś czy czemuś i bunt jest skutkiem frustracji i niezadowolenia. A niezadowolenie to musi mieć jakieś swoje źródło. Często niezadowolenie polega o tym, co władza publiczna czyni, jakimi to robi metodami, jakimi środkami, za jakie pieniądze, władze publiczne swoje cele. Zdarza się również, że źródłem frustracji jest już sam fakt, jak bardzo władza przed społeczeństwem pewne informacje o swoich działaniach czy bezczynności ukrywa. Wraz z rozwojem myśli prawniczej, w tym wyodrębnienia prawa człowieka i środków ich ochrony, ludzie zbuntowani mają coraz więcej narzędzi wyrażania swojego niezadowolenia i coraz więcej narzędzi do uzyskiwania informacji, dzięki którym ich bunt może być precyzyjniej ukierunkowany. Takim narzędziem jest gwarantowane wieloma aktami prawnymi, w tym aktami prawa międzynarodowego, prawo do uzyskiwania informacji o działalności władzy publicznej. Ona, tak się włączyła prezentacja. Mam nadzieję, że nie ma tego dyskusji. Poproszę od razu slajd 3. Proszę Państwa, takim narzędziem jest gwarantowane przez wiele aktów prawnych prawo do uzyskiwania informacji o działalności władzy publicznej, która ma zapewnić instruments
because public authority has to be transparent. One of the countries that was the first to assign its citizens the right to receive information on the operation of public authorities was 18th century Sweden, and Nordic countries lead the way in the transparent operation of their state. This right to obtain information from public authorities is indispensable for the expression of what's protest by against authority. Now, let's move on to slide 4. The first recommendation concerning the right to access to information from public authorities was formulated on November 25th, 1981. The Polish participants of the conference should reflect on their recommendations. How could these recommendations be in November or December 1981? This is completely abstract. Now, let's move on to slide 5. It was only when we were in the accession period in our constitution, adopted on the 2nd of April 1997, did we enshrine the rights to access to public information. And this right was also addressed in law, law which is currently running. Next slide. I refer to my predecessor, Dr. Ildico Laki. In 2 of the law on access to public information, each of us has access to public information about the activities of the state. However, of each of us possible, can the right of each of us be respected in today's Poland? And it's quite human. We prefer to boast rather than action of unethical or even illegal actions. This also relates to public authority. That's why the websites of information can provide insurmountable amount of data, but there are also information, there are also data that are hard to obtain from authorities.
dostępu do informacji
One
publicznej
such example
jest prowadzona
is
siłami prawnymi przez ponad 2 lata, dokładnie było to 749 dni, walka o ujawnienie list
the
listy
struggle
wybierających kandydatów
for
do Krajowej
showing,
Rady
for
Sądownictwa.
making available, for making
Chcemy
public
zaznaczyć tutaj,
a list
że
of
nie chodziło o ujawnienie
lawyers
nazwisk
who
osób prywatnych,
supported
tylko
candidates
osób
for
pełniących funkcje publiczne w tym Sejmie,
for
którzy popierali
authority.
kandydaturę na kandydatów Krajowej Rady Sądownictwa.
National Council of the Judiciary.
W dniach między 23 a 25
The
stycznia
lists
2017
of
roku
support
i już
were submitted by the Sejm
jedna z posłanek wystąpiła z wnioskiem o
in
zaledwie
2018,
udostępnienie
and on that
kontroli
day,
tych list
one of the members of Polish Parliament moved to the Speaker of the Sejm
2018 roku odmówił
to
udostępnienia
a decision by the Speaker of the
W
Sejm.
międzyczasie rzeczywiście
This information was
2018
used,
osoby nie wiadomo przez kogo popierane zostały wybrane na członków
who
Krajowej
were
Rady
supported
Sądownictwa.
by, we do not know
Decyzja
whom,
wymowna
were
przez Kancelarii
were
Sejmu została zaskarżona do Wojewódzkiego Sądu Administracyjnego w
chosen to the
Warszawie.
National
Decyzję tę uchylił.
National Court
Przez
Register,
Kancelarię
and
skargę
then
kasacyjną do Naczelnego Sądu Administracyjnego i Naczelny Sąd Administracyjny
between
wyrokiem
courts
28
and the
czerwca
Supreme Court of
2019
Administration.
roku absolutnie potwierdził, że taka informacja jest
Supreme
informacją publiczną i ona musi
the
być
Supreme Court of Administration confirmed in its judgment from 2019 confirmed that this is public information.
Sąd stwierdził tak, informacja o
Court said
aktywności
that
kogoś sędziów
information about the activity of particular judges as public officials
procedury konkretnego składu konstytucyjnego organu
revealing
Krajowa Rada
composition of a constitutional organ that is the National Council of the Judiciary
jest
is
informacja o szczególnej istotnie
information about
publiczno-prawnej i w dodatku jest taką informacją,
vital importance from the point of view of the community
informacją
and
nie znajduje
making it
podstaw w standardach
disclosed, making it confidential does not apply, and it is in the Polish system.
a mimo wszystko
Nevertheless, the head of the parliamentary office did not reveal this information, quoting regulations by
Obywatelskich do Wojewódzkiego Sądu Administracyjnego w Warszawie, który to postanowienie uchylił.
the authority safeguarding personal data. The president of
Kancelaria
this institute
ujawniła na swoich stronach internetowych
appealed against
dane 200
further
sędziów,
judgments,
którzy
yet the office of
Stało się to dokładnie w walentynki 14 lutego 2020 roku, czyli jak Państwo możecie sobie sami zweryfikować, po 749 dniach walki na drodze prawnej o
of
ujawnienie
legal struggle to have access to
To jest troszeczkę
public information. This is just one example. The legal framework of the time framework for our conference does not allow me to address many more examples of this sort. For example, the Office of the President does not reveal information on expert opinions for President Duda, for example, concerning the Constitutional Court, and we don't have available or easily available information on the activity taken by the current regime to reclaim the wreck of the plane that crashed 2010 here in Smolensk. Fortunately, we have judicial control over such decisions on authorities not to disclose certain information. However, public authority consciously and on a number of occasions wants to amend the law to limit the public access to information. Well, let me give you just a handful of examples. For example, the new law on Foreign Office adds the category of a diplomatic secret, which can actually apply to every single document. In addition, if you disclose this information, of the Foreign Office is liable to be taken to court.
mogłoby szkodzić polityce zagranicznej Rzeczpospolitej Polskiej i naruszać jej wizerunek międzynarodowy.
From the service. As you heard,
Definicja jest niezwykle szeroka,
this
wymagający
very broad definitions.
ocenę i ocena ta może być
Further
dowolna.
and
Jako ciekawostkę również
all of this is
moim
discretionary.
zdaniem przerażającą.
By way of an anecdote, I can say that in the ratio adendi of the draft legislation, the diplomatic secret is referred to only in one sentence.
Tajemnicy dyplomatycznej.
The definition of a diplomatic secret has been introduced full stop period. It means that such a major change, which strips us of our right to access to public information, was not justified in any way. You can also stress the fact that this
Żadne konsultacje nie zostały
government's draft law, which was submitted to Parliament, and as such, this needs no such public information. Other examples concerning the Constitutional Tribunal, for example, that the Chief Justice of the Constitutional Court is undermining the provisions of the law that has been in operation for the past 2 decades concerning access of citizens to public information. To conclude, expressing our opposition is always worthwhile to define the target of our opposition.
Prawo uzyskiwania od podmiotów publicznych
Access to public information is guaranteed, is enshrined in the Constitution. Let's use this tool now that we still have it, and also use it to determine how the authority is trying to strip us of this right. And let's rebel against this activity of the government.
Zapraszam do zadawania pytań.
Thank you for these interesting presentations, and now for the Q&A session, including online users. We've got the first comment or question from the floor. Please reveal yourself, Jan Sowa, to ask the question. The question is to Iwona Kurz, and it refers not so much to the images of protests themselves, but the performativity of a certain mode in which these images are circulated online, in particular as memes. Because it has been my sensation, more as a participant of these protests, which you described as an observer too, that what we deal with is a certain memification of protests, not only in terms of the visual language they operate with, but also a certain mode of use applied in those protests, and themselves becoming memes instantly, becoming recognizable at the level of visual culture and social media. So we've got these huge demonstrations with the slogans of fuck Law and Justice Party, and the 8 stars that stand for that slogan in the cardboard banners. I don't really know, and I'd like to ask you, as a scholar of visual culture, if such a way of formatting rebellious activity and rebellion itself, and I don't really mean those who are permanently engaged in a rebellion or have been engaged in rebellious activities for decades and will continue doing so, but rather what I mean is public stimulation or stimulation towards a society of protest that turns itself into a meme in a flash. Everything is suddenly attractive and then disappears as quickly as it appeared. So I don't know if this is all about the memification of the visual sphere online or whether it has to do with some independent phenomena. I don't know how you see it and what your opinion on that as a visual scholar is, as a participant of these events.
Dziękuję bardzo za wszystkie świetne referaty. Mam pytanie o afekt.
My question is about acoustic affect.
Prezentacji nie było na to za bardzo czasu, ale bardzo
I know that during the discussion there was not much said on that when it comes to affect, especially in terms of public protests. And the other question is to Iwona. You used the word hive. I myself used the word a shoal, as in a shoal of fish, and I don't know if that means a certain overlap, a hive or a swarm of bees that overlaps with my image of a shoal, whether you thought the same, as if a collective mobility or a mobile collective, and what stands what it represents, what it is underpinned by, and what sort of interactions it entails. Are there any more questions? So we can see Professor Czapliński approaching the pulpit, the podium. My first question is addressed to Agnieszka Korzeniowska. I'm not sure if you know if there is any precedence in any other state, be it Central European states or outside of our continent, a precedence in which the legal milieu became aware of the fact that members of the parliament are working on a bill of law that will restrict the access to public information, and they alarmed the society of this fact that inspired counteractive measures from the society that would prevent such an act from being passed. And if there has been no such precedent, then is it possible that the lawyers in Poland, in the context of this restriction to public information act, is there any chance for Polish lawyers to act as whistleblowers in this respect? My second question is intended for Iwona. I'd like to ask you, and it's a slightly imprecise question, but I'd like to ask it nonetheless. It has been my sense that you pitted power and emancipatory activities against themselves, which is obviously justifiable because it has been observed in any relations between the individual or the society and power. On the media plane, however, don't you think that we could or should also take into consideration a different confrontation, that between hive or swarm-like media and or decentralized media and centralized media? These hive-like media, including those measures as such as cell phones, Instagram, Facebook, and social media, could be juxtaposed with traditional conventional media, especially the Polish public television and the and its own battleship Potemkin, the main evening news, which operates so crudely that even the Polish People's Republic's propaganda pales in comparison. It is the perfect epitome of the centralist medium, and that for as long as over 2 million people watch the evening news on a daily basis and on public television, then I think that this centralistic tendency will continue. And my third question is to Filip Szałasek, and thank you for shifting our point of focus towards a different scope, a different thematic scope. If I understood you correctly, you're guiding us towards such a way of experiencing the audiosphere in which the crucial part is to tone down or abate your emotions and using them as a means of
Mam na myśli tutaj publiczne wystąpienia.
And say relieving your tension, but the audiosphere is also host to phenomena which act in a different fashion. They activate you, they enervate you, they mobilize and galvanize one towards being ready for an aggressive strike. So have you or others conducted any research on this aspect of audiosphere? I think the first such instance took place in Poznań, as far as the Polish sphere is concerned, was the demonstration on account sparked by the presentation of Golgotha Picnic, the staging of a controversial play that had two groups pitted against one another and shouting at one another. And one of these groups, the critics, used acoustics that were supposed to galvanize them and mobilize them towards a more aggressive stance. And I'd like you to consider that in the context of post-traumatic growth. If we could have our panelists address these respective questions. And also like you to refer to memes, if I may ask a question of my own. Could you refer to memes and the way they are used to refer the situation on the Polish-Belarusian border? I should start with the memes. As I said, it's a form, ready-made tool. As I said, you can make a GIF yourself. There are websites for that, and many of them, as a matter of fact. But this tool gives you ready-made representative tools that also imply a ready-made thinking pattern. Obviously, we should also factor in the fact that social media such as Facebook or Instagram and all of those image-driven media, especially Instagram, are strictly defined in terms of the size and type of images used, what filters should be adopted, and so on. So it is a very strong, very decisive aesthetic proposal, and a strong theoretical framework of reference for these representation. And so I said that these cardboard banners did resemble memes and were meme-like in terms of their ingenuity. and the ironic character of the slogans. They also resembled a social game in which contestants compete for the title of the most intelligent party or the wittiest party. One case in point can be the Pope John Paul II memes, which is a subgenre of its own in the Polish meme sphere, and it is a carrier of barnyard humor, crudeness of sorts, and it has its own idiosyncratic features. The question that could be asked is whether it's good or what follows from it, right? What I mean is a different level than that of the very presence of memes, but also the character of these memes in terms of formatting the character of events in which they are involved. Yeah, absolutely. And this actually goes hand in hand with what I said. You've got a set of ready-made hashtags, images, a pool of images that you can use, some of which will be more attractive than others. And there's a imaginary sphere involved in every protest, which acts as the carrier of these slogans and postulates. And as a matter of fact, they will be aestheticized in one way or another in any networking aspects, so whether you mean Netflix shows or cartoons or any other media. And whenever you want to browse through the archive of public protests, which features photographs taken by photographers who are not only professional photographers, but are also artists who focus on a given detail, then you will see the different ways in which people and objects are photographed. You approach a policeman or a policewoman in a different way, and you will photograph them in a different way and from a different angle than you do the protesters, and so on. So there are many aspects and elements that should be addressed, and the symbols too. So if you think of long-standing phenomena such as the women's strike right now, which has been active for the past 5 years and counting, there are some lingering symbols that establish themselves firmly in the public spheres, like the Polish fighting woman, but there are others that waned from the big picture. I'm not really fully prepared to address this question in detail, but I do have a friend, quote unquote, on Facebook that I haven't really banned from my bubble and who serves as a personal frame of reference for me, that uses different means. So he posted a picture of a border guard on duty in a heroic posture, and then on the other hand he did also publish a figure of a Polish family that helps the migrants crossing the border. But these two memes tend to simplify the reality. So the juxtaposition he presented simplifies the reality because it's not only about families of migrants and not only about a brave border guard watching over the Polish border, but it still takes us back to all those historical cliches, such as anti-Semitic Poles or Poles as those who saved lives of Jewish escapees from ghettos during World War II. And these cliches show us the simplification tendencies in these images, and these lingering images that serve a certain role, and that role is highly emotionally charged. If you think of migrants, you will see images of young bearded men as potential aggressors. And then again, going back to World War II, you'll have images of Anne Frank on the one hand, and on the other hand, you've got a group of people who take selfies hoping to cross the border and appeal to the conscience of Western Europeans. So these images definitely play a certain role, an emotional role, as I said, that they incite and spark protests, and they tend to be overused in order to get a grip of the situation. But it's a different problem of sorts.
This has something to do with the question of whether we can reap benefits from it. Whether the shoal of fish or the swarm of bees can fly or swim in the direction of another challenge. I do not know. Sometimes I have the feeling that these rallies are convened on an ad hoc basis. There are some slogans which group people. However, there's no discussion about refugees or whether we should have basic income. There's no what is present is the lifestyle. The practices of the ruling parties are the practices of every day. They're related to self-presentation, to striking relationships, friendships online, and this may be against this somehow relates to what Przemek Czapliński asked me about. In representations of protests, we see a large, colorful crowd, especially at the very beginning of these protests. This was sort of carnivalesque, and the police did not use violence. And on the other side, we have the arrangements of the police force, the same uniforms, masked faces. So this is the ideal model of a modern institution in operation. So the question is, how do we build a kind of community broader than the ad hoc protest? And television today, for example, that's why I gave the example with the smallest disaster. This was a return of an illusion for a few days that there is a single narrative, a single language, and community of the media, which is not true. That's there is no such thing. The government builds a narrative aiming at creating an image of a single Polishness, if you will. But if you look at it as a media whole, then we deal with pre-modern, modern, and post-modern practices simultaneously. When we speak about communication, we have those who don't watch television at all and those who watch only one channel. Actually, in terms of communication, if we think about television as a tool, and if we say that thanks to television, a given regime can gain support, it's true. But then if you think about the tendencies, it's not so easy. And it's also a question about all those who are not shown during those protests. Let's put up a nice protest. He shows the people in the windows. We remember people in the windows in Białystok during the Equality March. And these people have a still different attitude towards what is happening on the street. Thank you so much for answering this. We have a limited time though. It's very sad because I would like to ask an additional question. Very briefly, I'd like to address the question posed by Professor Czapliński. I would divide ways of appealing to emotions into three working categories. We have relaxation, one of the main modes of impacting people. When we Google Play and like meditation or relaxation, they're supposed to help wind us down, so that we can work even more efficiently a moment later. This is not relaxing, really. ASMR, or a narrator expressing different or using different objects very close to the mic, so that we have the impression that these activities are taking place very close to our ears. Combing your hair, or tapping your fingers on a box. The brain has to respond unconditionally. And the third type, perhaps the most interesting in the context of the history of the 20th century, reflection on evil or brutality, is the phenomenon that was known already during World War II, that is sound warfare, where you use all kinds of technologies, where you emit frequencies that are harmful to people. And the connection between the questions I'd like to make is that the three types of influencing people show that we are effective individuals, that we are linked to our bodies. We are sensual and sensory. Beginning is Zofia Posmysz and her texts from the Second World War, from concentration camps. She reminisces on her contacts with one of the perpetrators of violence in the camp. She's abroad and she hears a voice which is very similar to that of one of the guards in the concentration camp. So this is the acoustic effect. In Proust, we have the ear of memory, very sensual body memories are through the ear. And the third kind is linked with ecology or Anthropocene or Anthropopressure. A very interesting article about audiosphere, especially the audiosphere of nature and birds, is an article by Andrew White House, where he speaks about anxious semiotics. And he says that during the Anthropocene, the sound of birds, which is a stable, traditional, and conventional symbol of something positive, it ceases to be such, and this automatic positive reaction to birds is now triggers some pangs of conscience, because we automatically think, okay, the birds twit beautifully, but I'm one of those who limit their numbers. Thank you so much for the questions provoked by my speech. And I'm glad to say that Polish lawyers do a lot
do ograniczenia prawa dostępu do informacji publicznej nie doszło. I
not
ten precedent,
to
między innymi został
forestall
zdarzył się chociażby już w Polsce w 2017 roku, kiedy trwały prace
access
nad
to
ustawą
public
o
information.
życia
In
publicznego.
2017,
I te prace zostały
work was underway
przez
on the law
prawników
on
wstrzymane, bo wbrew tytułowi ustawa o jakości życia publicznego zdecydowanie miała
transparency
tę
of public
jakość
life,
ograniczać. I
somehow
warto też
against the
zwrócić uwagę,
title.
że
This
różnego
law
rodzaju
was
organizacji pozarządowych,
to
takie jak
limit
Watchdog na przykład,
transparency.
która
We have
siedzi
also a number of
aktywnie na
NGOs
polu dostępu do
like
informacji
Watchdog
publicznej.
who are
I
very
prawniczy
active
jest chociażby
as far
opracowanie pana
as
Szymona
right to
Osowskiego
access to public
dotyczące
information is.
nadużywania prawa do informacji, a
We
de
have
facto jest to analiza po badaniach, jak pod
analyses
ograniczyć nadużywanie prawa do informacji. Próbuje
by those
się
different
ograniczać
organizations
prawo do
that point
informacji i
out
tam są również
how
doniesienia
the
o tego,
government is limiting
jak
our
takie ograniczenia wyglądają,
rights to
kiedy,
public
proszę państwa,
information.
bo faktycznie czasami
Also
jest tak, że jako
having
wnioskodawca
information
poprzez
on how
zadawanie
these
non-stop pytań przez strony organów władzy publicznej może sparaliżować
how
pracę
this
tych organów.
right is limited in other
Kilka
countries.
dni temu było
A few days ago,
przedstawiciele wolnych sądów
representatives of free
apelowali do
courts
opozycji, że no to
called on the opposition
tak,
to
trzeba podjąć konkretne działania.
take
Promujemy
action
pewnie
in parliament
zachęty do prawnego
to
ograniczania dostępu do
ban,
informacji
legally
publicznej.
prevent
Warto też zajrzeć na stronę
actions aiming at limiting
wszystkie
our
przypadki takiego ograniczania prawa
information.
dostępu
So
do
we have the
informacji
Olsztyński
publicznej. No i
archive,
przede wszystkim strona
which
internetowa Rzecznika
documents
Praw Obywatelskich. Rzecznik Praw Obywatelskich jest tym prawnikiem
such instances.
i
The ombudsman is the lawyer
współpracę innych
and
prawników.
encourages
Bardzo aktywnie dzień po
other
dniu
lawyers to
walczą o
cooperate,
to, żeby
and
to prawo
they
dostępu do informacji publicznej nie było nam odebrane. I
for our rights, they
walczyli o nasze prawa
fight
dostępu do
for the
informacji
right
publicznej
to
na
access
początku
public
pandemii,
information.
kiedy ustawą z 31 marca 2020
The pandemic,
różnego rodzaju
some of the
określone przepisami prawa
some of the
i organy
deadlines
władzy publicznej
stipulated by legal instruments were frozen, and the public authorities tried to use these
sam pan premier nawet mówił, że przecież
provisions to
teraz są ważniejsze rzeczy
postpone
ważniejsze czynności do
responding to
podejmowania niż odpowiadanie na
motions for
wnioski o
public
udostępnienie
information.
informacji
The Prime
publicznej.
Minister said
I
that
między innymi w
we are
skutek
dealing with
masowanych
more
protestów
pressing issues than responding to
prawników z Watchdog,
information, responding to questions for public information. However,
2020 roku już 14 maja 2020 roku zostały uchylone. Także tutaj podaję takie
eventually repealed. So
precedensy z naszego państwa i wskazuje na to, że w zasadzie walka o prawo dostępu do informacji publicznej trwa dzień po dniu.
for
Tak, i tutaj
access
rola
to
prawników
public
jest
information is a daily struggle, and I'm afraid what we do as lawyers is underappreciated. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all the speakers, and we close the third panel, Tactics and Tools, and I believe we will continue the discussion during the break. Thank you so much. Katarzyna Czarnota, the moderator of this panel. Now we have a coffee break. If you're missing on something, like a cup of coffee or something, We will start at quarter past 5.
Tak?
na ostatniej sesji pod tytułem Protesty i ciała. Pierwszą
To our final panel today, protests and bodies. Agnieszka Graff is our first speaker. Agnieszka, are you with us? Can you see us? Can you hear us? Yes, I can. Wonderful. I don't think I'll lose any time introducing the speakers in the panel, since you can all read their bios online, as Przemek mentioned. So without further ado, Agnieszka, the floor is yours, and please stick to the 15-minute limit. Am I heard and seen? Yes, you are. Can you please render my screen available to everybody? As we'll do our best. In the meantime, I'll introduce the title of your presentation, The Evolving Language and Symbolism of Women's Protests in Poland between 2016 and 2020. So we will take on the notion of symbols, imagery, and discourse of women's protests in Poland in the recent years. Because hopefully you will see your presentation in a moment, because indeed it is essential to see the visual layer of a presentation whenever visual aspects of a certain phenomenon are discussed, as is the case with your today's paper. Tak, włączyłem. Wiesz co, ja nie mam wyłączenia nad hostem, bo nie mogę nawet przesajnować. Normalnie bym mógł, że on na 100% jest.
Tak? Nie wiem, bo rozumiem, że nie widać jeszcze mojej prezentacji.
nie widać, ale jeżeli masz taki wstęp, który jej nie wymaga, to może rzeczywiście było.
Myślę, że wszyscy znają te obrazki, więc one głównie są ilustracyjne. Chciałam jeszcze raz bardzo
We are all familiar with these images, so I don't think that I need them indeed. Well, in any case, I'd like to thank you for the invitation and apologize to you for any imperfections in my presentation, because I have been struggling with post-COVID symptoms, as mentioned before. I'll try to present three theses that are governed by an underpinning argument that was first voiced by Iwona Kusz, which is not controversial, I guess not too controversial at least. Namely, I think that the protest of 2020 in Poland, women's protests in Poland 2020, were a disruption of continuity when it comes to the symbolic sphere, but I'd also be inclined to agree with the discussion earlier on today that this continuity would also disrupt it when it comes to forms in which the internet is used, and I think I'll address that in the discussion ensuing after the end of our respective presentations in this panel. So I'll start with the first with the first slide, excuse me, on October 20th, 2020, groups of high school alumni in Warsaw danced the Polonaise dance at the seat of the Law and Justice Party in Nowogrodzka Street in Warsaw. These dancers did not really know about the wave of outrage demonstration that took place in the same place 4 years earlier. I don't think they were aware of the fact and the overlap of these two demonstrations, because they were children at the time, and this was a great generational watershed between 2016 and 2020 that took place in Poland. In the feminist milieu, this generational change is unpopular. Rather than speaking of generational differences, we tend to talk about intergenerational sisterhood and claim that your birth date has no significance whatsoever, since grandmas protest side by side with their granddaughters, and the word boomer in Polish dziaders is a masculine word that refers to any person, any sex and any age. as long as they are outdated and old-fashioned person. It is also true that the time and the generational change are of capital significance for the forms of protest. To me, personally, the form of protest is important in the sense that in 2016 I felt I was the host of those protests or co-host of those protests, and in 2020 I felt more like an observer and a guest at these protests, which were not really easily understandable and approachable to me as a representative of my generation. I had to decode them. So my claim is that the women's strike in 2016 and 2020 are only seemingly two installments of the same phenomenon. The name is the same, the leaders' names are the same, the logo stays the same. However, we have no continuity here in place, but rather a spectacular disruption, because within those 4 years, we could see a clear switch in the poetics of these protests. These symbols and the names of these protests were changed, and the emotional atmosphere that accompanied these outbreaks of activism too. Now, since I have not too much time in my presentation, I will get straight to the point on my three theses. The first thesis is the most important one, and it concerns the change from patriotism and the language of feminism that is partially in dialogue with the Polish patriotic tradition. We transitioned towards a football fan language. And trigger warning alert, I will be cursing in my presentation, which I normally try to avoid, but it is unavoidable in the context of discussing this protest and the language. And what is interesting to me in this football fans protest is this phallic character. The second thesis is the transition from pathos and rage towards fury. And even though fury was featured in the first wave of protest, then fury as outbreaks of uncontrolled anger, fleeting as they are, as Janek Sowa pointed out, these forms of protest were oriented not so much at fulfilling any goals, but at creating a space for communication, and that was the meme-like character of protests that remained in dialogue with one another, and another feature of them is their serial character. My third thesis, which is the least original one, since it was already addressed by Przemek Czopiński and Inga Iwasiuk, is the fact that we transitioned from the language of protest that was founded on a condensation of symbols, a certain congestion informed by equality and patriotic symbolism, towards a spectacle that is informed or underpinned by a loss of language and a sense of helplessness against a sense of communicative crisis, which I diagnosed back then as a disestablishment of the social contract established in the transformation era. On October the 3rd, 2016, on what is now known as Black Friday, Warsaw was swept by torrential rain, to which we owe the beautiful pictures with a sea of umbrellas around the Sigismund column, and the fact that the umbrella became a symbol of women's protest. Most of these umbrellas were black. As we remember, and the symbolic color of these protests was black, and the media called these protests the Black protests, even though the organizers stick to women's protests. Black as a symbol of national mourning after the death of women's rights was an ingenious idea in its simplicity. It was enough to dress in black in order to join the community of striking women, even if you didn't participate in women's protests in the street. I got emotional myself when I was walking my child to her school. And I saw that not only most mothers, but also all teachers were dressed in white. Black also had a symbolical dimension because it embedded women's strike in Polish history through clear references to solemn marches of the partitions period. And the umbrella itself was also a clear reference to the tradition, or rather a national mythology in Poland of the mythical tale or the story of the suffragettes that used their umbrellas to knock on the windows of Józef Piłsudski's villa, demanding that he grant women the right of suffrage. So we also had the inscription "Solidarity" tied in to the umbrella symbol. One of the most poignant slogans back then was Tadeusz Boyżoleński's book title "Women's Hell," a seminal book from the interwar period, and the use of this cluster, accompanied by the departure from liberal slogans with focus on the word choice, was used in order to tie the intergenerational experience of women who fought for a right to abortion before the war and had to fight for it after the transformation. In many protests, you could also see a poster, a reproduction of poster by Sania Ivekovic, the Invisible Women of Solidarity, carried as a banner that later evolved, as you can see, over time. In Black protests of the first wave in 2016-2018 were a wave of feminist rebellion that was inspired by national symbolism and remained in a constant dialogue, partially ironic and partially solemn, with the Polish patriotic tradition. I think it was both ironic and solemn. The case in point for the patriotic, dominant, and historical character of the strike is the symbol of the fighting Polish woman, which you can see in the following slide, I believe, yes, which featured a Warsaw Uprising anchor sign retouched to include a braid and nipples. It was omnipresent. It was painted on walls, posters, flyers, bulletins, stickers, post stamps, and social media profiles. The symbol was a subject of continuing debate. It was sometimes questioned and it was argued about as far as its significance was concerned. For sure, the fighting Polish woman was a hostile takeover of the Warsaw Uprising anchor from the hands of Polish neo-fascists who had appropriated and commercialized it. We all can remember the tattoos, t-shirts, and even bed linen with the Warsaw Uprising paraphernalia and symbolism. In other words, Polish feminists captured this sign and abrogated it. Some of these Polish women used the sign literally. They saw Polish women fighting for their own independence and dignity, and their struggle was organized and waged in the vein of Poland's historical struggle for its own independence. And the other one was more radical and anti-nationalistic and picked Poland against Polish women. Since Poland betrayed Polish women, it is only natural that Polish women rebel against Poland using, ironically, abrogating one of its sacred symbols. Both of these sins were in use simultaneously, and the symbol was under heavy fire from the nationalists, with several lawsuits filed, and users of this symbol accused of desecrating it, since it was legally protected at the time. My thesis can be counteracted by the fact that one prop tied in separately to the protest, especially the first wave, was the metal coat hanger, originally international and first used in America and then appropriated for the cause of Polish women. Women used different slogans such as "Damn Utery," "No Women, No Country." They were used to express indignation and despair and declare a sense of dignity, often the first person. So, such as I think, I feel, I decide, my uterus is not a chapel, I won't give birth if I'm dead, the border of contempt, and so on. So this was, in other words, a mobilization of women who felt betrayed by their own community, but were nonetheless part thereof, and addressed their rage to Poland through the depository of a communal memory. The protests that broke out in the fall of 2020 were not only different in terms of iconography, but also in terms of their emotional aura. All accounts render the radical difference of these events from any other protests that took place after the takeover of power in Poland by the Law and Justice Party. And I will now quote an account by Piotr Paziński, a Polish writer, who wrote, "This is a different rebellion and a different revolution. It is perhaps a rebellion of the first generation born and raised in Western civilization." I'm running out of time, so I will not read the entire statement from Paziński. But what was key in his entry on Facebook was that it was a rebellion without memory, and the key symbol of these aspects was the new symbol, the lightning bolt that replaced the umbrella or the references to the fighting Polish woman. They were replaced by this slogan of "This is war." To be honest, I was flabbergasted when I saw a media feature from a media report from Kielce, excuse me, which featured such slogans as "Get the fuck out of here" or Kaczor, which is an informal nickname of Kaczynski, "Stop tormenting my fucking uterus," or "Fuck the police," or "Fuck the Polish bishops. Once we do, maybe they will kindly sod off." And taking a closer look at these youths who were jumping around and shouting these slogans, I was wondering to what extent the use of the football fans' language was a takeover of a masculine code, and to what extent it stemmed from the participation of working youths in protests, especially in the smaller towns. And I'm inclined to think that this latter thesis is more appropriate. Inga Wasiuk, a Polish writer and literary critic, interpreted the role of profanities as subversive, while also noticing the tension, especially around the word jebać and fuck in Polish. And she noticed that this was the first time that the people took to the street, not the people who think of themselves as the people. So I agree with that, and I think that intuitively I am right, even though I don't have any rigid evidence for that so far. I think that the phallic character of such words as "fuck off," "go fuck yourselves," "get the fuck out of here," is strongly charged with phallic significance, as well as rejection of discursive appropriateness. So we have feminism, which not only ironically borrows the word fuck from football fans and football ultras, but also turns it against its original users and throws it against other addressees, the bishops, the ruling class. Aside from the phallus, they also the striking women also used the woman's body. And the corporeal language itself. So some of the slogans were "My pussy is that of my own." The Polish government is so flexible that it can make itself comfortable inside my pussy, and the mimic character of these slogans is something that inclines me to point out that these cardboard banners were made as if in series. They conversed as if with one another and were produced in a way that was evocative of a series of jokes on the same topic that produced the sense of an autonomy of sorts, as observed by the critics of the new wave of protest. So we have the nicer version of these slogans that was used later on, that also used a high register of language. For example, Kaja Godek, the Polish anti-abortion activist, eats soup with a fork, or the Law and Justice Party brews tea based on pierogi water. Or if you want to control your life, Kaczynski, go play Sims. This is not the world that Tony Stark died for, or every country has the Voldemort it deserves. And there were also slogans directed to certain groups and persons, flash mobs, and street dances. All of these were typical of slacktivism, of climate protests, Occupy Wall Street, or ultra-globalistic protests. And tactics characteristic to these protests include citation, rehashing, or retouching of signs that function in the commercialized circulation, such as corporate logos, in the sphere that is privatized and commercialized. And since the language in case of Poland has been colonized by the Catholic Church, I think that most of these slogans were at the very bottom addressed towards the clerical class in Poland. All these fuck off slogans were addressed to Polish bishops, and they were subversive in that respect. They also reject the certain paternalism of Polish intelligentsia, the Polish intellectual class that were referred to as boomers by many of the protesters during the strikes. And my original intention was to finish with a quote from Szymek Szczepiński, but since I don't have much time, I will let him take the floor himself. Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. And since we do not have too much time, we will move on to our next presentation and the exclusion of of persons with disabilities from public life. Ildico, are you here with us?
Just a moment, please. This one is my presentation. I
Great.
think.
So you have 15 minutes.
Okay, 15 minutes. You are welcome. This from Budapest, from Hungary, and from Milton Friedman University. Is it okay that everybody watched the PPT? Yeah, okay. So this one is an interesting theme I choose and fitting for that conference. My name is Ildico Laki. I came from Budapest, Milton Friedman University, and my research area is people with disabilities in Hungary and in the world. It's a very important thing, and I think it's a disadvantaged position nowadays in the world and in Hungarian area. But a lot of positive thing to do. So the first of all, Goethe, tolerance said that tolerance can actually only the feeling that just a moment, please, only a passing feeling. It has to lead to recognition. To endure is too often, said Goethe. My opinion that we thinking about that disability people or people with disability. So I want to start with an introduction, a table of contents, my presentation system. I will talk about the introduction, why this theme, and what's that main important thing. The first of all, people with disabilities nowadays, number and situation. And the second one, social issues, disability questions. What is a problem? Problem is a problem. And third one, legal framework, domestically and internationally. And closing remarks. I think it's closing remarks, but we are thinking that this is a problem, this question. The second one, or third one, this picture is, we have very different and difficult in the world. We have visual, hearing impaired, and the visual impaired, and special needs or special education needs. So that disability group is a very huge group, large group, and difficult group. You can see that the next one, you feel that disability problem is not only a problem with disabled people, the problem or we solved the problem and other people too, a social problem. So that introduction. With regard to Hungarian society, the issue of disability is still only a settled issue. The question is, the main question is, who is the people with disabled or disability people? So we know that an individual with a physical or mental function or structures is a disability in his or her activities, action, participation, communication, and requires special circumstances to us in the condition, in mental and physical condition. There is 3 levels problem in nowadays in the 21st century. The first of all, that social problems, solve problems, perhaps the most pronounced, maybe integration, segregation in the education system, in hospital, I don't know, is a lot of places. And the second one is a political problem, political questions, the rights enforcement, voting rights, for example, that the political system is divided. For example, I agree or vote for main important questions. Is that a mental disability people? Why? Because they don't use and they don't decide the problem. So, and the third one, and economic problems, economic question, financing, support, labor market is very important thing. That's a remark. Hungarian system and post-socialism system, about 4 or 7, between 7% people from that disability people is working now. And this economic benefits, same problem too. So that the issues of equal opportunity needs to be recognized in each of these areas. Equal opportunities, not divided, not solve that the problem, but main important, solve that the problem, disabilities problem. So first of all was problems at the social or societal level. Increasing number of people with disabilities, elderly people with disabilities. In Hungarian system, 100 people from 100 people per 137 people per elderly people. But from disability people per 40-45%. And the second one is a social network, is social problem, societal problem is the social network, or institutionalization issues, integration issues. But I have a good thing too. Born a baby with not disability problem. Nowadays, this declined at the number nowadays in Hungary. The second one, problems at the political level. Complex problem, what people with disability have a right to, discrimination and equal opportunity, and the civil rights and the non-profit sector, for example, and non-profit sector working in this disability area, and not government is working in this disability. And the third one is economic problems. So that I mentioned employment, unemployment, support system. How can we creating support system for these people, or education and labor market issues, education system. If they have a number growing, we have solved that the education, in education, for example, visual or hearing impaired people or students. So people with disability nowadays, how can we see that nowadays? More than 1 billion people in the world live with some form of disability, and their numbers are rising year by year. Nowadays is this date 2018, I think, from and growing up that disability people. The consequence of an aging society in an increasing proportion of older people with disability, I mentioned that 2 slides. So in Hungarian and the European Union's data, in 2011, there were almost 50 million people of working age, this disability. In the European Union, 27. In Hungarian, same same date and number is almost 500,000 people, and plus those with health problems people. It's not only disability and health with health problems. And the last period, we have a microcensus period, declined that number, but not so many number. So that the problem is you can see a number. Social issues, disability, and questions. The European Union's disability policy, although different from the country to country, is an area that is very late, absolute late in this century. The European Union's disability policy has long been in the shadow of economic policy, community level initiatives in 1970s, yes, and significant and more significant change in 1990s. So that this is a later solve this problem. Scandinavia, since 1880s, the principle of applying stakeholder legislation in integration strategy has been present. but interesting things after that. We see that the absolute good working in this system. Yes, but in Scandinavia started after 1990s. So that, for example, public funding affected became a solution. So that it's a keywords and system prosperity, subjectivity, and main important that equal opportunity people by people. And the German modernized approach with the principle of process, same started in 1990s, and positive change in number of areas that because of the basis of model utilitarian principle, because the decision-making mechanism based on the change of attitude, that people have another attitude with that deal this or with the problem. So European Union, there's a German and Scandinavian and a very important and main line for disability people, solve disability people problem. But that the European Union is the same solve this problem. But the first real disability document born in 2004, nowadays. In spite of this, the Treaty of Rome did not address the problems of people with disabilities in 1958. So, main plan, European Equal Opportunities for People with Disabilities and European Action Plan was a first plan. And that line for main foundations, complete implementation of the directive on equal treatment, employment and occupation. And the second one is community policies. And the third one is accessibility, that, for example, tourism, education, and healthy system, same. So that the legal work framework, domestically and internationally, Hungarian, I mentioned that Hungarian inclusion and discrimination were the most prevalent. After that, until 1998, there was a first Hungarian summarizing the rights of people with disabilities. Is very, very important and very, very huge step was in this system. So that the Landmark Equal Opportunities Act, the main thing, this law does not call disability or limitation of social activity disabilities, but recognizes circumstances that make it difficult to integrate sociality. Main important, integration, not segregation, integration, and acceptable and accept for disability people. And we as a process of European legal harmonization in 2003, and born that the new framework and the main line that for that disability people. Hungarian adopted a United Nations Disability Code, and which requires member states to ensure equal access for people with disability, recreation, and tourism too. So, closed remark, because we have 3 minutes. Closing remark. What is the problem? What is the situation? What is that? What's the question with disability people? The international or European disability issue has been resolved similarly to Hungarian line. The fact, the number of people with disability increasing, even more so for that elderly. we have solved this problem, social system, and we have solved this problem, hospital system and healthy system too. At the individual level, subject well-being, the main important thing. Well-being, social well-being, and well-being are paramount importance, which also raises economic indicators. And the last one is the integration of people with disabilities is twofold. It depends on the capacity of society to be inclusive and the openness of people with disabilities. So political, economical, and social area entered in a disability people and social people integration together. And thank you very much for your attention. Please, I finished my presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. Now I would like to give floor to Ewa Majewska. Przepraszam, zaczęłam mówić po angielsku. Chciałabym teraz zaprosić do wystąpienia Ewę Majewską.
Majewskiej. And now I'll pass the mic to Ewa Majewska, who will speak about weak resistance, feminist counterpublics in Poland after 2016.
Ladies and gentlemen, I suggest that we all rise for just a second. In keeping with a gesture of famous Western activists, or maybe in the grain of the Polish athlete Władysław Kozakiewicz, who performed this gesture for the first time in Moscow during the Summer Olympics of 1980, expressing the general sentiments of the Polish society towards the Soviet oppressors, live in a broadcast of a pole vault competition. So you can perform this gesture of defiance with both hands in the spirit of our organizers who keep us active and mobile, especially since this is our fourth and final panel, and we are due for still more panels tomorrow and after tomorrow. So I should probably start by thanking the organizers and all those who are joining us here live and online. In preparing for this paper, I went over my articles and publications in the past 4 years, in which I kept stressing how very conformist Polish research methodologies have become in the past years in the Polish academia. And so a conference which is representative of narratives of rebellion and movements of defiance is very timely and a very poignant idea. I also thought that in the past years, I have conducted seminars on feminism and anti-fascist feminism and the way in which feminism changed from a marginal fringe topic to a new thesis, which I'd like to propose today, namely that no theorist of politics today can say that fascism does not lie in a center of our at the center of our ruminations. Feminism lies at the center of our considerations today, just as well, especially when it comes to migration, the body, exclusion, which are topics of conversation today and topic of academic debates as well. And I was supposed to talk about feminist protests after 2016. And as you know, if you know me, I tend to address ongoing topics. I don't wait until they have fully transpired, but I address them from the get-go as they develop. So we don't know if wypierdalać, you get the fuck out of here, is the final word of Polish feminists, since it might occur that there are many more communications that will be uttered. And getting back to Aristotelian times, the discussion on politics and policies, and discussions are limited to a certain kind of persons, persons that are usually not working persons, not slaves, not women, even if they were aristocratic women, because they were preoccupied with giving birth in ancient Greece, at least in the eyes of Aristotle and his contemporaries. And in Aristotelian political doctrine, slave was not defined as a human being in the first place. So yeah, probably not stick with this particular philosopher for too long without verging dangerously into inconvenient topics. Now, anyway, the political sphere was traditionally concerned with what was not directly linked to production, to economy. Oikos did not refer to sexuality, to gender, to reproduction, and this very concept and the principles of the theory of public sphere, as understood classically, were summarized by Jürgen Habermas in his supposedly progressive book, who wrote that the public spheres of the working class, even if they occurred, they were not very significant historically, and this is what brings me to a boiling point, because I was born in Gdańsk, in the city that saw the demonstrations at the Gdańsk shipyard. I was 2 years old when my mom took me to one of these demonstrations, and I don't know if my first word uttered was mother or strike. I'll leave that to my therapist. Anyway, I have always been preoccupied with workers' strike, and I was irate after reading Habermas before I found Oskar Nechte and Oskar Kluge, who picked up on what Habermas wrote in his liberal interpretation of the public sphere and counteracted them. Why is it important for feminism? Well, it is because the matters of reproduction, division of labor, division of gender, and so on, we always wanted to see these matters as political and to be tied to feminism. Now, Alexander Kluge, 1972, whom you know from his film and books, and Oskar Nechte co-wrote a book, The Public Sphere and Experience, which will hopefully be available in Polish sometime from now, in which they addressed the public spheres of the working class. And they agreed on the fact that the public sphere is usually seen as one, in which all stakeholders address vital matters. The opposing or underground public spheres are plural and guarantee true democratic character and authenticity of discourse, as stated by Nancy Fraser and the different discourses of feminism, which she poses in her and her analysis of North American feminism, which she sees as multifaceted, contradictory, self-contradictory, always engaged with political patriarchy, but not always opposed to the capitalist discourse. So we have to think of these discourses as a hybris rather than a monolith that uses the same language which we all understand very well. Nancy Fraser also came up with the notion of subaltern. The translation of Spivak got translated as publiczność in Polish, so counter publics of the subaltern. To Fraser, the political discourse is a discourse of geopolitics, inequalities, anchored in political discourse and the categories and being subaltern or subalternity as defined by Spivak. So once I started dealing with the counterpublics of the subaltern, I thought of how unconscious stereotypizations between the East and the West in terms of theorists, women theorists and politicians reveal themselves in the concepts of such notions as solidarity. So a leftist Western thinker will see solidarity as an interesting working class movement, but that very same guy in, let's say, the 1990s, solidarity was perceived as a neoliberal machine to reproduce the capitalist ideology. So we could see a shift in the terminology connected to the political shift in Poland, and the very same entity, which was the Solidarity movement, similarly to any other movement, such as the women's movement in Poland, were treated very differently after this caesura. Now, this category is useful with reference to feminist initiatives because it enables us to address a certain package of notions that are entailed within a single or many movements. We addressed a number of these issues here today, and examples such as that of the Polish actress Krystyna Janda, who incited outrage and defiance, as well as teachers from around Poland, or anonymous women or average women in small town Poland, as well as urban feminists who were well organized. So we had diverse entities with different visions of emancipation included in these street protests. An interesting fact for any researcher in 2016 and 2017, the number of women who attended demonstrations was much greater than in the years before, even though the anti-abortion ban was in place for over 20 years by then. And to a large extent, we can owe that and attribute it to the informal leader of the government, Jarosław Kaczyński, who was very harsh and staunch in his criticism of women against anti-abortion laws, and wanted to force them to giving birth and maternity. And we were also thinking of different metaphors that would capture these different cases and cruel stories, such as the recent story of Iza of Pszczyna, and the state of affairs which afflicts Polish women, and the metaphors that resemble fascist reality. So we've got this state of emergency and the state of emergency on the Polish-Belarusian border. In the heterogeneous hybrid feminist movement, we've got a certain deal of boldness, as Agnieszka Graff mentioned, a number of patriotic references, a lot of solemnity, but also highly articulate postulates and needs that depart from the cliches and standards typical of the public sphere. And in this sense, perhaps this is a more inclusive language. At a certain moment, I was asked, okay, so we've got this counter publics of the subaltern or of women. So how do they function and who makes them up? I started to think if this political activity that is indispensable to these counter publics or to the subaltern, this political agency is non-heroic, and it goes against the grain of what we are habitually inclined to see as political activity. So, we've got this charging mounted horsemen with a lot of bravado charging against the enemy is not really an adequate figure. Even Antigone, who in the classical interpretations is seen as the voice of civic society in a critical circumstance, or the woman's voice, Judith Butler points out, rightly so, that Antigone is addressed to as a man by her father. She's part of royalty. Well, we don't need Judith Butler for that. Nonetheless, Butler did reinvent Antigone and casts a different light on her. And Bonnie Honey, another theorist, I think she's American, but her book was published by Oxford University Press, and a book called Antigone Interrupted. Bonnie Honey says that without Ismene, she would not be able to act. She was intertwined with her sister, so even if Antigone is more classical in her agency and subjectivity, requires an alliance with another girl that does all the effective work. She's fragile, she's sensitive and delicate. So it's not just about empathizing with Antigone. That's not the sole task of the other woman in the drama. So we should expand that effective role onto other women, not only one or two of them, and not only sisters or friends, but a wider range and a broader context. And it has been my impression, I know that I have only 2 minutes left, I'm inclined to conclude that these public spheres or counter-publics, which we'd like to operate with as feminists, they will have to rise to the challenge and be performed in an updated state of emergency, in which some people were not only dubbed as external enemies, but as others that should be terminated, such as Polish pregnant women or refugees on the border. And this is one thesis which I hope you'll take on and challenge, that our strategies of weak resistance or non-heroic resistance should be informed by standing up to the cruelty perpetrated by the political world. Otherwise, our situation will become even more dire than it is now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the speech and for being attentive to the time frame. And our last speaker for today is none other but Professor Czapliński, who will speak about the War of Carnivals, protests in Poland in the period 2015-2021. I'm so glad that so many of you have decided to stay with us till the end. Also those who watch us via the internet. What I want to show is a set of hypotheses which need not be very precise, and that's why I would be more than grateful for any of your comments and remarks. When we look at the protests in Poland of the past 5-6 years, or if we extend the time frame to the last 2 decades of the 21st century, we will notice that these protests relate to issues which are important enough and so different that they shouldn't be put into one category. We have a very serious group of protests in the defense of human and civil rights. Stand here both the defense of women's reproductive rights, the defense of sexual and minority rights, and the defense of democracy, that is the constitutional court, the independence of the judiciary, of the media, of all of the elements of the rule of law. These are the protests which provided an impetus to public life and which received the most coverage in debates. These protests, we saw them as most representative of social issues of the past decade. However, there are, at this time, we have a lot of protests of a different character, which may not be linked to the defense of the rule of law. The other group of protests may be called social ones. Please note that according to sociological data, since 2005, when the Law and Justice Party first came to power, strikes in the public sphere are 68% of all protests. Only some 30% of the protests happen outside of the public zone. Healthcare workers in all the different occupations, for example, radiologists, nurses, residents, and each time it was a strike of another group. Only once, I believe, this year, the strike was shown as related to the entire health sector. We also had a strike, a teacher strike, which was over 60 days. A bit shorter, but no less dramatic, was the strike of parents with disabilities. It's good that we were made aware of the magnitude of the phenomenon by Laki, Ildico. We have big differences between these two types of protests or groups of protests. And the difference is significant enough that there is no common language, there are no common slogans. During protests, in the defense of the rule of law, we do not demand free, better healthcare system. We want public transportation to be better invested. We defend courts, we defend the right to abortion, we defend public media, the constitutional court, and the constitution itself. There is no common language that would merge, that would help to merge, that would join the two realms, the two spheres. This is, I believe, the original sin of the Third Republic of Poland. This is the underlying fundamental diversion between social rights and civil rights. Civil rights were guaranteed to a narrow extent because it was in 1993, 4 years after the birth of the Third Republic, the abortion law became more stringent, and in fact, a liberal democracy was transformed into a narrow, parodistic version of a liberal democracy that is going to shrink increasingly. Since 1989, we have dealt with a permanent division into social rights and civil rights. These social rights were very, very poorly defended. Perhaps this increasing desolidarization of public life after 1989, a third group of protests, because irrespective of what we feel about it, right-wing nationalist, populist slogans should also be taken into consideration during this conference. Statements which attack the European Union, the European flag, where the EU is treated as an institution that colonizes Poland, where sexual minorities and women are raided and discriminated against, where you hang deputies to Polish Parliament portraits on makeshift gallows. These are the protests. These are the protests we have in mind. A group of people furthering their goals protest against a certain state of affairs. The difference between the first and the second group, that is between the defenders of the rule of law and those of the social issues, people who demand the betterment of the operation of the public zone, the difference lies in the fact that only one group is attacked by nationalists, that is, the defenders of the rule of law. Nationalists, neo-fascists are ready to fight them actively. There were no nationalist or neo-fascist statements against parents of children with disabilities, but it's very easy to hold a rally against those who favor the right to abortion. If we look at the rallies held by the defenders of the rule of law and neo-fascist or populist rallies, we see a marked difference. Again, let me give you a hypothetical again. I believe the defenders of the rule of law during their protests practice the same society that they defend with their slogans. There is a cohesion between what these people preach, what they sing and chant, and what they practice during their protests. We might say that they celebrate autonomy. They celebrate the autonomy of the individual. The defenders of the rule of law are first and foremost followers of clear, transparent, clear-cut limits that that guarantee autonomy to the individual. If we empower an individual, then this person is no longer liable to be a victim of domestic violence, of public assaults, any direct assault. Only the principle of autonomy can lead to the defense of the independence of the judiciary. We have in mind a state where no one would threaten a judge that they would relocate them 200 or 300 kilometers away from home, because this is actually a violation of the principle of autonomy of the judiciary. The defenders of the rule of law celebrate them and practice, praise, defend the autonomy of not only individuals and bodily integrity, but also the autonomy of the state and the society. There is no rule of law, there is no set of honored rights of human beings and citizens if we do not have the autonomy of individuals, institutions, and interpersonal relations. If we look at nationalist slogans, nationalist protests, we see that they practice a completely different carnival. That is, theirs is a carnival of direct access. We deal here with they want to touch another person, to defame, and to attack verbally and physically attack a person, to force them, to humiliate them, to force them to leave the country, to force them to migrate, to exert an impact on them. We deal with two radically different carnivals, which are practiced by two different types of societies. The current right-wing authority encourage right-wing and nationalist groups to practice direct access society because it gives the nationalists the sense of agency, we say. This is amoral. It's skewed, but it's actual. It means that you can actually come up to a person in the street and can punch them in the face. You can also perform acts of domestic violence at home. This means that within the first carnival, the carnival where we want to praise the rule of law and when we want to defend the principle of autonomy, there is something is missing here, namely this individual autonomy does not build a sense of community and does not give a sense of agency. Whenever I think about the people who support the Law and Justice Party, I think we can answer this by saying that this nationalist right-wing vision of the state gives you three things: rootedness in tradition, even if this tradition is very simplified. So profound tradition, a tradition that gives you a sense of dignity, a communal bond, which is very strong, which is born out of unity, and finally a sense of agency. And these three principles are missing in the first carnival. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much.
20 minut na to, żeby przedyskutować tezy
I think
zaproponowane
we can devote at least 20 minutes
nawet pół godziny. Dobrze, zobaczymy, czy wytrzymamy, ale
to discuss the things,
zagramy trochę więcej
discuss the
czasu.
things we spoke about.
Kto chciałby zająć jakieś stanowisko, zadać pytanie? Proszę bardzo. To też
Like to
zapraszam tutaj, żeby było widać i słychać wszystkich. Czy ktoś jeszcze się zgłasza przy okazji? Tak, dobrze. To ja też od razu będę cię prosiła tutaj bliżej.
Ja mam pytanie do...
My question is to the first speaker, Agnieszka Graff. I understood that you claim that the most recent protests for the sake of the right to abortion, you intuit that this is a new generation, and to use a football fans language, the use of the football fans language is proof, is potential proof of opening a trans-class space of the protests. I doubt if this is really a football fans language. Whether swear words are only football fans language, or an everyday language of communication of young people. I remember my experience from primary school. Yes, it's a phallic language used by men, by boys, but this was everyday language. So these young people took over so much the language of fans, but they used their own language. Let me also tell you a story about my badminton practice. During those practices, I don't have people who are theater specialists, but these are people my age, my peers. We play badminton together. Always when I make a great pass, then the phallic language is used. My second question is to Przemek Czapliński, and it concerns the juxtaposition of protests in the name of civil rights, in the name of social rights, and right-wing protests. This is some kind of simplification. To what extent are they really protests in defense of the law? Aren't they internally diversified? Perhaps these different emancipations are mutually exclusive. To what extent is the protest in defense of the Constitution a protest for legal abortion? When we think about the stigma of the Catholic Church that we feel in the Polish Constitution, those who initially thought that these women's strikes were to uphold the status quo, these were protests for protest against Polish law, not so much in defense of the legal order. So I was wondering if this division is perhaps difficult to defend.
Już jeszcze online'owo chciała zadać pytanie Agnieszka Graff i Marek Bejlin. I może zbierzmy te 4 pytania, a później już w następnym, bo widzę, że są kolejne
I have 2 more questions, 3 more questions.
zadawane na odpowiedzi. Też bardzo bym prosiła o zwięzłość, a później będziemy mieli jeszcze drugą turę. Zapraszam.
Ja tak pociągnęłam najpierw ten pierwszy wątek, o którym mówił Marcin, to znaczy właśnie języka, bo miałam dokładnie to samo, prawda?
Marcin spoke about language, and when I heard the Fakov slogan, it was said that, well, there is no comments were that girls don't use this language, but it's enough to watch some Polish movies and see that this language is pretty much used. So I was wondering whether what Marcin was saying is not right, that this may not be specifically football fans' language, but more generally the language of young people. And then again, we heard about the collapse of the social contract. We had questions about the community. Can a community work and be together? Can we really benefit from this tug of war between the two parties? The collapse of the social contract. Did we have a social contract in the first place? I know that this year 1989 is a caesura, but this is very arbitrary. I don't know if we can speak about a social contract in the first place. So I would not so much follow the division into social protests and protests in defense of the rule of law. And we also heard that the same groups protest over and over again. Yet there are all kinds of different protests in factories, asking for a raise, asking for the betterment of working conditions. So all of this was to counter the privatization of public space that the ruling party is after. And in the footage shown by Agnieszka Graff, we saw a transition from bricolage protests to identify protests whose main tool was social media, which helps disseminate fixed symbols, fixed signs and logos. A word of comment. Sania Iwekowicz, this is, I believe, a subject matter for a different debate. This was an artistic intervention, the invisible women of solidarity. How is it that in the second decade of the 21st century, we are still discussing things that we were discussing during seminars 30 years ago? So an artistic work tries to be taken over by the street. It's a different kind of solidarity that this sign shows. To what extent is it a social postulate, and to what extent is it a reference to a recognizable icon?
Dobrze, to a może, czy ja mogę prosić, może najpierw Marka, a wtedy byś Agnieszka zadała pytanie i od razu odpowiedziała, co? To może to byłoby łatwiejsze.
Perhaps we'll first give the floor to Marek and then to you, Agnieszka. You'll ask your question and respond to the question asked to you. Marek, you gotta unmute yourself before you ask your question. Okay, am I loud and clear? Great. So also like to refer to what Agnieszka said. Greetings to everybody from Warsaw, by the way. I agree with my colleagues that this is not a takeover of the football fans' language or idiom. It's just the use of informal language used casually by groups of people of various social stature and from different generations. You could hear this language in any given club in Warsaw on a daily basis. This is the language of young Poles, even young Polish intellectuals. It is very idiosyncratic in the sense of its informal character, anti-systemic language, which ties in with the postulate of the women's strike that are also posited between the two other systems outside of the system pushed by Law and Justice and outside of the system promulgated by the Third Republic of Poland. So the common conclusion for them is that these old systems are no longer fit and we have to seek for new quality. Outside of this disruption or discontinuity with the Third Republic and the extension of these postulates to more general postulates, so secular state, rule of law, extension of granting of full civic laws to members of the LGBTQ community. It all points to a holistic revolt on the one hand, and on the other hand, these protests saw a mixture of different themes that originated from a certain continuity of the patriotic tradition. I can also recall a certain demonstration that was the last one among these spring demonstrations, in which one of the Polish painters carried her piece, a woman wearing hussar on a horse, which incited a lot of interest and discussion. It was a very pertinent representation of Polish tradition, one that was partially subversive too. That is it as far as Agnieszka's paper is concerned. And as for Przemek, I agree that part of these protests have been and are in fact the carnival of individual autonomy, as you referred to it. To me, it was mostly characteristic of the first phase of these protests that were closely tied to the defense of the rule of law and the constitutional tribunal, or in general, the protest of the Committee for the Defense of Democracy. Women's strike introduced another dimension, the solidarity-based dimension, and a more holistic angle to the depiction of and representation of reality, and a more universal postulate of amending the current state of affairs. So I think that this carnivalesque quality of these protests is only one of the aspects of our current protests. And with reference to Iwona and Przemek, in fact, in terms of social and political protests, obviously these protests are different. They operate with different languages and refer to a different imagery, which we know from the Polish People's Republic. And the departure from social protests and their transition into political protests is quick and rapid. Every social protest carries the potential of transforming itself into a political one. Perfect. Thank you very much, Marek. I shall now give the floor to Agnieszka. You said you had a question and you also wanted to refer to or address questions from your colleagues. Okay, my question is addressed to Przemek Czapliński, and it ties in with what Marek Bejlin said in pointing to the complications in this elegant mapping of autonomy versus accessibility. The solidarity as a dimension of women's strike introduces some sort of commotion here. Another source of commotion here is that Polish nationalists collaborate with Polish anarchistic capitalists of Janusz Korwin-Mikke or the anti-vax movement and their interpretation of the libertarian principle of free choice and refusing to wear a mask on account of that free choice. So this is just to make things more complicated, if I may. I'm happy that my simplification caused many protests and stirred many controversies. I agree with the fact that it is not the football fans who came up with the word wypierdalać, so get fuck out of here or fuck off. I use it myself in informal circumstances when I need to. It also infiltrate to the language of our youth and children. What I had in mind, though, was that these slogans did refer to the language of football fans. So HWDP or fuck the police is a slogan addressed to police around the world, or the notion nie będziesz nigdy nie szła sama, or you'll never walk alone is a long-standing slogan of British football fans dating back to the 1940s. It has been used in a lot of songs, and it has been appropriated or abrogated by the radical queer movements. And so what we have to keep in mind is that the football fans aspect of this language is part thereof. And then the absurdist notions of this language. Kaja Godek eats soup with a fork, excuse me. There are a lot of these witty slogans, for instance, in Łódź, and the very weird fan feud between OKS and Widzew, two Łódź clubs, and the absurdist slogans like OKS uses OKS needs to warm up before going number 2. Widzew shaves its legs and doesn't change his pants, and so on and so forth. All of these notions made it to the childish slang as the yo mama, as part of the yo mama jokes. In this kind of language and jokes, the football culture also plays an important role, and I think that in one of the last wave of protests, it was said that many football clubs subscribed to the postulates of Polish women. Although not true, it tapped into the widespread desire of having protests backed by football fans. And if you take a look at the Kielce riots, Kielce, demonstrations, these are not radical, hostile marches of vaginal feminists, but rather feminists who appropriated and reused the phallic language of football fans, although granted, it was not the only idiom that they abrogated. For example, if you think of the coat hangers that were used and that were supposed to be complemented with crochet hooks. But I would stick to my point and I'll hold to my guns and defending this football fans angle. Perhaps I should need for more evidence in this respect. Thank you very much. Before I'll give the floor to Przemek, a very short question to Eva. I'd be glad to share your diagnosis, but having participated in a number of debates and conferences on populism, and where it seems that it is obvious and it goes without saying that the gender notions are taken for granted and are not even taken on by researchers as vital, or they have not been addressed on a theoretical plane to a sufficient degree. So perhaps it's part of the current balance of power and the current shape of public sphere. So I'd like to ask you about that. And without further ado, I'll give the floor to Przemek and Eva.
I'm thankful for this question and for the debate. There are many reflections on football fans, football supporters. We should have a separate conference on football fans and their lives. And it would be easier to determine what was taken over from them. I was myself assaulted by 3 girls who wanted to snatch away my phone. And first thought about their overcoming another gender limit. I simply started to laugh, and then they decided to quit. Now, when it comes to the recognition of feminism in the center of today's politics, this is my diagnosis about the factual state. Most of the politics is about bodies, it's about the division into public and private, and about productive or reproductive work. So there are many problems related to the questions of refugees, which work has priority. So with this very general understanding of these issues, that is productive or productive work, the problematics of the body and gender, there are many forms of discrimination. When we look at different social movements of recent years, this is because, well, the right wing are very much interested in our bodies, especially recently. Most used to recognize feminism as one of the elements of the change for the better.
Stronę centrum, nie w sensie, że chciał być lewicowy czy jakiś tam inny, ale w sensie, że wokół niego się toczą najgorętsze spory. I teraz mam takie wrażenie, że to wpływa na badaczy i badaczki, w sensie takim, że Roderick Griffin na przykład, taki wiodący brytyjski,
Griffin said
zaczął w końcu uznawać
he finally started to recognize my argument. We discussed this for the past 3 years, and in his most recent publications, he recognizes my argument. This starts to change, and deal here with an elephant in a china shop. Most of the conflict is around women issues and so on and so forth. The social consciousness does not follow up on that. When I titled my feminist book Anti-Fascism, I received a lot of attention. From my perspective, his book was like anti-fascism for boys. Now, I told him if I were a domestic worker, would I be invited to your anti-fascism? He said, yes, but I understand what you are thinking about. So a caring woman wouldn't fit in there. So actually we're talking about how we build anti-fascism, and we might opt for greater diversity. The argument is linked with what say you present with Agnieszka your research on anti-gender. For me, anti-gender is a form of fascism. We also need to check whether feminist has the answers. Przemysław? I would like to support Agnieszka. I like the concept a lot. I believe you're right. I believe you're right about the language. It's not that vulgar language comes from the language of football fans, but it's them who first used these slogans and words as a weapon in public meeting, as a weapon against their enemies. So language as a tool, as something for action. This is taken from football fans, because they were the first who used this language as a public weapon. Everybody uses swear words, professors and menial and some blue-collar workers, but yeah, I agree with Agnieszka's statement. Marek, this is a good suggestion that those social protests have a political potential, and it's easy to move from there to questions related to the rule of law, but nobody's making this step. And far more interesting for me, and this is a rectification of my reflections is this aspect of solidarity of women's strikes. And perhaps we will start to renew the social bonds, because without women's issues there is no solidarity. Marcin was also asking a question. I'm very thankful for that. You're right. However, you're right that these protests related to the Constitutional Court or the independence of the judiciary, we had marked differences between different groups. But if we asked for potential alliances, it would be easier to hold another protest in defense of the rule of law, somebody who has already taken part in those protests, than to hold a protest related to some local issues, about, I know, the local school bus, and one related to different issues related to the rule of law. The biggest issue of all protests of the past decade is that we have two avenues. That is the defense of the public sphere and the defense of the rule of law. There is no bridge between them, and we cannot counter that.
Okay, very shortly, the second round of questions.
Tak. Ja przez chwilę właśnie zacząłem się zastanawiać, czy włączyć, czy nie włączyć w tam dyskusję o dystynkcji klasowej.
Okay, I was thinking whether or not I should comment on the discussion on the origins of vulgarisms and profanities that is in the latest waves of protests, and I was thinking of whether these profanities were already present in Andrzej Lepper's self-defense and his farmers' protests back in the 1990s. I think they were in use, but a lot changed in that respect in the meantime. And as for the class distinction, well, I'm still working on that. And I'm not sure as to the sociological aspect of the notion of identity politics and redistribution politics, and how these two tie in and how they are interlinked or not. And this brings me to my question, because I can't forget about the fact that we live in a post-socialist realism and the reality of a post-socialist country, where a lot of these social postulates have been disarmed by the response. Okay, we've already had it. We've already dealt with that during the Polish People's Republic. So whenever you deal with the pertinence or non-pertinence of social protests, you cannot really overlook the heritage or the legacy of Polish People's Republic, and I'm interested in what you think about it. I'd have a lot more questions, but before I'm lynched for prohibiting you from going to dinner, I will make it short and sweet, starting with Agnieszka Graff. Just a side note, if I may, which I will build on in my tomorrow's presentation. I think that this fighting Polish woman, the Warsaw Uprising anchor, transcended the original meaning and did indeed playfully engage historical policy of Poland and agency. And when we think of the fact that it was used by women to refuse reproduction, whereas the original anchor was linked to the masculine Warsaw Uprising staged by men born by the Polish mother. So we have these two feminine figures, the Polish mother and the fact that in the official Polish culture, the woman, the mother, was supposed to be groomed into becoming a mother of a soldier ready to lay his life on the battlefield for the fatherland. And very strongly, this sign was accentuated in both your presentations and tapped into the Polish patriotic tradition in a way that it sees the Polish mother refusing her obligation or denouncing this obligation of being a mother, giving birth, or the obligation towards the law of maternity. As to you, Ewa Majewska, I think we'll take it to dinner break after this session finishes. I'd like to ask you about how the rules of state of emergency change the rules of counter-publics and their engagement. And Przemysław, I have several questions to you, and maybe I'll just ask one. I have just realized that our interpreters, I would continue gladly and would address Joanna's questions, because I've just realized that our interpreters have been working for 10 hours almost, and I think that we can shift all these discussions and questions, engaging as they are, to our dinner meeting, and we can move our discussion for tomorrow. We'll definitely address all these topics, but I guess that as far as today is concerned, Elżbieta, I think that we will entitle you, since you're the moderator of the session, to close it officially and finish our today's sessions in toto. Okay, so there is a long list of questions which I'd like to shift to our dinner meeting, but I'd just very quickly like to ask you about the 500 plus and the social discourse on the 500 plus parental benefit or allowance in Poland. So many people, many working class representatives are accused of selling democratic rights or civic rights or social liberties for social provisions or for welfare provisions. Is that so? And what do you think about that? And the other question is, does Poland allow for a narrative, a pride narrative, in which an LGBTQ group walks hand in hand in solidarity with a majority oppressed groups such as the blue-collar workers? two things I'd like to address would be, well, starting with the movement of women, which was really spectacular, and the fact that it saw the largest strike organized by women, by members of our teaching groups and teaching bodies. It was correlated with acts adopted very swiftly, acts that sometimes subverted teaching principles and legislation. And I think that in this respect, we will be highly challenged to regain the support of teachers and the teaching community. So I think that there is a high problem between the struggle of women and industrial action that could have been filed, where thousands of schools participated in the reproduction of the education system in Poland, and we let it go to waste. And my second point, which ties in with my morning utterance and the last Saturday demonstrations all over the country, ani jednej więcej, not a single one more, in commemoration of the woman who died because the doctors refused her the abortion despite her life being put at risk. And the questions that were asked, the sense of relief that it wasn't my mother, my daughter, or my sister. No. So are we after solidarity based on empathy, or, as Czulariaki says, a solidarity based on ethics and irony? And whether or not we have lost our chance. Okay. Now, the question is, what do we do with the responses? I think that our capacity and the capacity of our interpreters, at least physically and mentally, in fact, prohibit our discussion from continuing. So without closing these topics officially, I would encourage you to carry them over to more informal circumstances over dinner. I myself have a few questions, in fact, so I'd like to thank you all for staying with us throughout the course of this day, and hopefully I'll see you all tomorrow fresh in the morning. Thank you for today. Thank you very much, and hopefully I will see you tomorrow at 10. Thank you very much. I'll see you live, and I'll see you in front of your screens virtually. So thank you. That's it for today, ladies and gentlemen.
Recording stopped.